VIII begins with a catalogue of the ships of the Greek navy at Artemisium. While the Athenians had wanted to be in command, the allies at subsequent meetings demanded Spartan leadership. The Athenians didn't argue in order to ensure unity. For now. The Greek forces were terrified at the approach of the Persian navy, which, despite the storm, were moored at Aphetai with more than 10 times the number of ships that the Greeks had. The Greeks would have fled, but the inhabitants of Euboea, the nearby island, gave Themistocles an enormous bribe to stay and defend them. Themistocles was the Athenian commander who had convinced the Athenians to send out their ships in the first place. Themistocles uses some of the money he had been given to bribe Eurybiades, the Spartan general, and some of the other commanders to stay as well. The Persians sent 200 of their ships to go around the island to flank the Greeks, blocking their retreat, but an Ionian diver on the Persian side reportedly, but doubtfully, Herodotus says, swims the whole way to the Greek ships to warn them about it, deserting to their side in the process. It would take days for those ships to complete their journey around the island, but in response, the Greeks sailed out to attack the main Persian fleet immediately. Despite being surrounded and outnumbered, they captured and sunk a great number of Persian ships by using the diekplous, their trademark naval maneuver. Today, we do not know what this technique consisted of for sure. We only know that it required coordination between allied ships and in numerous cases allowed the Greeks to fight navies far larger than their own. A storm came in the night after the two sides returned to their respective harbors. The main force of Persians are terrified and demoralized, but their 200 ships sent around the island are completely destroyed because they were out on the open sea where the storm was much worse. Herodotus attributes these events to the will of the gods to save Greece. The next day, the Greeks received 50 more ships as reinforcements from Attica, and then attacked the Persians again in the late afternoon, leaving little time for retaliation. In fear of Xerxes' reaction to the losses they had taken, the Persians started the fighting themselves on the third day. These happened to be the same 3 days as the Battle of Thermopylae. On this third day, both sides took heavy losses. The Athenians received special honors for their deeds on the Greek side, even though they lost half their ships, as did the Egyptians on the Persian side. But the Persian fleet came off worse because there were too many of them in the strait, and they frequently rammed into each other by accident. Due to the condition of the Greek navy at the end of the day, though, the Greek commanders decided they would retreat the next morning. During the night, a messenger arrived from Thermopylae telling the commanders about the defeat of Leonidas and his men. The commanders then wanted to sail away immediately. However, Themistocles believed that if the Persian fleet were to lose the ships from Ionia and Caria somehow, Caria being another Greek-settled region in modern-day Turkey, then the rest of the Persian fleet would not be a match for them. He carved a message on the rocks at Artemisium, where the Persian fleet would surely arrive once they learned of the retreat. This message was addressed to the Ionians and Carians, telling them to defect from Xerxes, leave his army, or purposefully fight subpar. Themistocles figured that it would either work as intended, or, even if it didn't, the Persians would stop trusting the Ionians and the Carians. The Persians advanced as expected following the Greek retreat. They received a message from Xerxes telling them about the outcome at Thermopylae and inviting anyone from the navy who was interested to come and see what happens to those foolish enough to think they can overcome the might of King Xerxes. Xerxes had buried all but 1,000 of his own army's dead out of sight, while putting the 4,000 corpses of the Greek soldiers at Thermopylae in plain view. Many of the sailors took him up on the offer to come and see the battlefield, but they did not believe his ploy with the bodies. The next day they returned to their ships, and the land army continued its march. The Thessalians got the Persians to enslave their neighbors and enemies, the Phocians. Their town was burned, their temples plundered, and many of their women were to death. From there, the army split in two. Xerxes took one half to go burn Athens to the ground, and the other half set out for Delphi to plunder the temple there, which was famous for all of the rich offerings it contained, chief among them those made by Croesus prior to his war with King Cyrus. The Delphians asked the oracle whether to move the gods' offerings or not, but it told them to save themselves instead. It insisted that it was perfectly capable of defending its own property. As the Persian army approached the sanctuary, a lightning strike hit Mount Parnassus nearby, sending 2 enormous crags hurtling at the army, killing many of them. The Delphians attacked them then, and the Persians fled. Some from the fleeing Persian army later claimed that they were pursued by two impossibly tall armored warriors, who the Delphians say must have been their deified local heroes, Phylacus and Autonus. For the Greeks, cults honoring dead heroes as well as gods were commonplace. Meanwhile, the Greek fleet that retreated from Artemisium anchored at Salamis, just off the coast from Athens, so that the Athenians could evacuate their families. Many ships joined the fleet from mainland Greece at this time, bolstering its strength beyond what it was at the previous battle. Few new ships had come from the Peloponnese. Most of the Peloponnesians under King Leotychidus were instead building a great wall across the isthmus that connected them to the rest of Greece, appearing to be concerned only for their own survival. Herodotus gives us a second catalogue of the ships, mentioning that the Aeginetans, Naxians from Ionia, and several Aegean island cities were all present in the alliance. With all assembled, the Spartan commander Eurybiades holds a council of war, urging all to speak their minds. Many present wanted to sail to the Peloponnese, where they could support and be supported by the land army there. This sentiment only strengthens when news arrives that Xerxes had come to Athens in person with his army and had burned the entire city and countryside. It was mostly abandoned at this time, but there were a few poor and elderly people that had stayed to defend the Acropolis. They defended it for some time by rolling boulders down the hill at the Persians, but in the end they were massacred. That night a regular Athenian soldier named Mnesiphilus approached Themistocles on his ship, asking what decision the commanders had come to. When Themistocles told him, he replied, "Better not. Once the fleet leaves Salamis, there will no longer be a country you can fight for. Each contingent will disperse to its native state, and no one, not even Eurybiades, will be able to stop the fleet falling apart. This is a stupid plan which will spell the destruction of Greece. You have to find a way to reverse the decision, to persuade Eurybiades to change his mind and stay here." Themistocles sees his wisdom and goes quickly to get the Spartan to reconvene the commander's council. In council, Themistocles repeated many of Mnesiphilus' arguments as if they were his, with some added points. If the fleet fought at Salamis, where most of their families had fled to anyway, the Persians will once again be forced to fight them in a confined space, and they would never arrive at the isthmus where the seas were much more open. Fleeing to the isthmus meant leading both the Persian fleet and army down to the Peloponnese. The Corinthians protested that Themistocles should keep his mouth shut, since he no longer had a state to represent since Athens had burned. Themistocles responded in anger that the Athenians still had a city and a country, and one greater than theirs, as long as they had 200 ships ready for action, since there was no Greek state that could repel an attack from them. He exhorted Eurybiades to act as he suggested, to become the savior of Greece. Eurybiades is convinced, either by the arguments or by fear of Athens leaving the alliance. Meanwhile, Demaratus, former king of Sparta, joined with Xerxes, stood on a plain in Attica with Decius, an Athenian that had joined Xerxes. They observe a giant dust cloud headed towards Salamis and hear a great cry of the word Iacchus. This is ordinarily part of an Athenian festival honoring the god of the same name, Decius explained to Demaratus, but there were no people left in Attica. Thus, Decius interpreted this as a divine omen, foretelling disaster for the Persian fleet. Demaratus warned him not to tell Xerxes about this, as it would likely cost Decius his life. Xerxes went with Mardonius to visit the commanders of the fleet once they arrived in Athens. Mardonius was tasked with covertly asking each commander whether or not Xerxes should fight the Greeks at sea. Each one said yes, except for Artemisia, the queen of Halicarnassus. "Master, do not commit the fleet to a battle. At sea your men will be as far inferior to the Greeks as women are to men. Why should you have to run the risk? Have you not captured Athens, the point of the campaign? If you keep your fleet close to shore, either wait here or advance into the Peloponnese. The Greeks do not have the resources to hold out for any length of time. However, if you rush into a sea battle, the defeat of the fleet will cause the land army to come to grief as well. Besides, good men tend to have bad slaves, and vice versa. There is no one better than you, and you do have bad slaves, the Egyptians, Cyprians, Cilicians, and Pamphylians, all of whom are useless." Xerxes held her in higher esteem than ever before because of this advice, but decided to fight at sea anyway, believing that the men would fight better than at Artemisium if they knew he was watching them. Xerxes sent his land army on towards the Peloponnese, where the isthmus wall was nearly finished. The Peloponnesians in the fleet reconvened the commanders again one night in order to argue for a retreat. Themistocles, with his side on the verge of losing the debate, quietly slipped out of the meeting and sent his most trusted slave to Xerxes with a message, claiming to be sympathetic to him. "The Greeks are in a state of panic and are planning to retreat. Unless you just stand by and let them escape, you have an opportunity here to achieve a glorious victory." The Persians quietly sailed out, dividing their fleet in two to block both ways around the island of Salamis, eager to get the Greeks back for their earlier defeat. The Greek commanders kept arguing until they were given the news that the Persians had surrounded them. Given this, the debate ended, and the fleet prepared for battle. Themistocles gave a brief speech to his men, urging the soldiers to consider the better and worse aspects of human nature and choose the better part. The battle began at daybreak. The Greeks remained organized and tactical throughout, while the Persians lost their plan and became disorganized. Xerxes stood on the shore, recording the name and country of every captain of his that sunk an enemy vessel. Knowing this, all of the Persian fleet captains eagerly pressed their ships forward, but ended up ramming friendly ships in front of them that were attempting to retreat, just as often. An incident like this caused Artemisia to be even more favored by King Xerxes. While being pursued by two Greek ships that surely would have caught and sunk her, she took a calculated risk and intentionally rammed a friendly ship, sinking it almost immediately. When the Greek ships saw this, they assumed that she must have been on their side, and so they left her alone. Xerxes' servants told him that Artemisia had sunk an enemy ship, at which he is said to have exclaimed, "My men have turned into women, and my women into men." Luckily for her, no survivors appeared later to expose her deceit. Herodotus tells us that the Persians could not swim, while the Greeks could, and so many more of the Persians died than the Greeks. As the Persian navy began to retreat, chased by the Athenian ships, the Aeginetans came out from where they were hidden to block them. Both of these former enemies, the Athenians and the Aeginetans, performed admirably together, although they exchanged some friendly insults in the process. The battle ended as the Persians retreated, and the Greeks pulled ashore to prepare themselves for another engagement. Xerxes, however, was frightened by the disaster. What if the Greeks now got the idea to demolish the bridge at the Hellespont? News of the defeat reached Susa, causing all the citizens to weep and tear their clothes in fear for the king's life. While he outwardly made as if to continue the campaign, Xerxes quietly took counsel from his two most trusted commanders, Mardonius and Artemisia. Mardonius was afraid of being blamed for his role in starting the campaign, and so blamed the cowardly Egyptians and the other non-Persian regiments that had come with them for what had happened. He offered to stay himself with only a force of 300,000 Persians to finish the job of enslaving all of Greece, while Xerxes himself could go home. Xerxes shared this plan with Artemisia, the only one who had warned him to avoid fighting at sea. She advised that he take Mardonius up on his offer and go home. "If he succeeds, the achievement is yours, master, because it was your slaves who did it. But if things go wrong for Mardonius, it will be no great disaster as regards your survival and the prosperity of your house. The whole point was to burn Athens. You've done that, so now you can leave." This was Xerxes' intention anyway, so he accepted her advice. Xerxes told Mardonius to proceed with his plan, then fled by boat in the middle of the night. The Greeks tried to pursue them once they realized what had happened. Themistocles wanted to get ahead of them and demolish the bridge at the Hellespont, while Eurybiades disagreed. With no off-ramp and cornered, Xerxes would be a much worse danger to Greece than ever before. Themistocles pretended to agree. At this point he was well liked and trusted by the entire army, so they were ready to do almost anything he asked. Themistocles then began sending letters to all of the Aegean island cities demanding money, threatening to bring the Greek army down on their heads if they refused. The other commanders did not know he was doing this. Mardonius escorted Xerxes back to Thessaly. Once there, he set up his base for the winter and picked 300,000 of the best soldiers in the army. 2 Spartan messengers arrived during this time, demanding compensation for the death of Leonidas. Xerxes laughed. "All right then, here's Mardonius. He'll pay them what they deserve." An oracle had told the Spartans to do this, and accept whatever was offered. Xerxes continued home, escorted by Artabazus, one of the commanders of Mardonius's division of the army. Many men died of dysentery and other diseases on the way. As a result, Xerxes crossed the Hellespont with only a small portion of the force he had come with. Seeing the Persian army in this condition, some of the peoples they had conquered en route revolted. Artabazus spent the winter once more conquering them and reducing them to slavery again. Meanwhile, the Greeks gave treasure and honors to those who distinguished themselves in the battles, and offerings from their loot to the temple at Delphi. Themistocles' recognition throughout Greece only increased. In the spring, the Greeks prepared for the war to resume, with Leotychidus, king of Sparta, in command of the fleet. Xanthippus commanded the Athenians. Mardonius sent a messenger to all of the local oracles and enlisted Alexander of Macedonia to go to the Athenians with an offer of alliance. He figured that if they joined him, he would control the sea, and the rest of Greece would fall easily. Herodotus calls this an entirely justified confidence. Alexander was also considered a friend by both the Persians and the Athenians, so he was received well. He delivered his message from Mardonius, filled with the usual threats of the king's great power and his willingness to allow them self-government. "Be free by making a treaty with us and joining our military alliance." Alexander also added a personal appeal in fear of what would be done to the Athenians. "You are the only people in Greece whose wrongs the great king is prepared to forgive and with whom he wants to be on good terms." Spartan messengers, worried about the outcome of this meeting, were also present. "It would be intolerable for Athens to be responsible for enslaving the rest of the Greeks, when in the past you have always been known to free others from slavery. Don't let Alexander win you over. He is a despot, and despots support one another." The Athenians first rejected Alexander on account of Xerxes' burning of Athens and their willingness to fight for freedom. They also reassured the Spartans not to doubt them, for they recognized a shared language, heritage, and way of life for all of Greece. And so, they would never make a deal with Persia. Books 7 and 8 together chronicled the beginning of the end of the Persian Wars. The battles of Thermopylae, Artemisium, and Salamis are what caused Xerxes to fear for his life and to return home. Book 8 shares many themes with Book 7, and like Book 7, completes many of the themes from the rest of the Histories. For example, the events of history are portrayed to be the result of many small decisions intentionally made by individuals, as in so many other stories of the Histories. Themistocles, Mardonius, Xerxes, Artemisia, and Eurybiades all make a collection of choices that have incredible consequences, but my favorite choice in the whole book is made by Mnesiphilus, an ordinary Athenian soldier who just happened to bump into Themistocles, his commander, and asked how the deliberations were going inside. It is what this man says to Themistocles that prevents the Greeks from retreating, which then allowed them to use the narrow straits to their advantage against the larger Persian navy. There were many other ordinary people that contributed, of course, such as the diver that warned the Greeks of the ships sent to flank them, as well as Themistocles' slave that carried his message to Xerxes. The unifying theme of Book 8, though, in my view, is the importance of speech, communication, and dialogue, pursuit of the truth, and of the logos. How the two sides participate in this idea, or fail to, determined their fortunes in this war. Xerxes and the Persian commanders routinely lie because of fear or in order to inspire it. The truth is not valued, and neither is the freedom of each person. At the initial council of war in Book 7, Xerxes invited free speech, but disingenuously. He really wanted his commanders to tell him what he wanted to hear, like Croesus long ago, and was enraged at those who cared enough to actually tell him the truth, like his uncle Artabanus and Solon long before him. Mardonius, who flatters Xerxes for selfish reasons, is heard out instead. Later, before the naval battles in Book 8, Xerxes sent Mardonius around to covertly ask each ship's captain's opinion on fighting the Greeks. Perhaps it is an awareness of what Xerxes tends to mean by "give me your opinion" that causes all but one captain to tell him that he'll be successful. Perhaps it is fear that urges them onward, as Xerxes has always believed was best. But that does more harm than good. In fairness, Xerxes did not punish Artemisia for giving a contrary opinion, just like he didn't punish Demaratus in Book 7, but he didn't listen to her either. It took a hard lesson both on land and sea for him to take their counsels more seriously. Perhaps this is understandable, as the majority of Xerxes' commanders disagree with both of them. But whose fault is that? Speaking of fear, Xerxes remains steadfast in his belief that fear is the most important factor in motivating his men. We see this when he invites the navy to come sightseeing at Thermopylae. Come and see what happens to those foolish enough to think they can overcome the might of King Xerxes. It is fear based on a lie, though. Just as the commanders lied to Xerxes to make him feel better about his prospects, Xerxes lied to the navy to make them feel better about theirs, or to intimidate them into performing their best in fear of his reaction if they failed. Xerxes showed this belief again at the Battle of Salamis, for he believed that his army would fight better if they knew he was watching them. His navy must have been familiar with Xerxes' preferred method of inspiring his soldiers, for when fighting near Euboea, we are told that it is fear of his reaction to their heavy losses that drives them to initiate an attack on the Greeks on the third day of the fighting. The Persian navy sunk its own ships by mistake in both sea battles, which is equally the result of the captain's eagerness, inspired by fear, as it was its great size being made useless and harmful in a small space. The same thing happened at Thermopylae, when portions of the Persian army were trampled or pushed into the sea while pressing forward into the pass. This was a weakness foreseen by Artabanus, one of the only people willing to tell Xerxes the truth. Using lies to inspire fear, and fear that inspires lies, only gets the Persians so far. In the end, truth always reasserts itself. Truths such as the vulnerability at the Hellespont, which was also foreseen by Artabanus. Xerxes realizes his danger after the disastrous battle at Salamis, and speaks privately to Artemisia, another person whose honesty and wisdom became clear to him far too late. Note that even the context of this conversation is based on lies. Mardonius, truthfully afraid of being punished for the failure of the campaign, blamed the non-Persian contingents for their defeats, offering to take only the Persians to finish the conquest while Xerxes returned home. However, Herodotus tells us that it was in fact the Egyptians who performed the best in the fight. No matter though, both Mardonius and Artemisia lie and throw them under the bus to save their butts or to flatter Xerxes, respectively. Artemisia and Mardonius agree on another point too, that Mardonius is only a slave to Xerxes, and so any success of his glorifies the king, while any failure of his is of no account or loss to him. Xerxes departs, pretending to agree with them both for the reasons they put forward, while actually just trying to save himself. Xerxes crosses the Hellespont back to Persia with his army in tatters, a walking memento of Solon's mantra. Many of the people they pass revolt, for it was only fear of the king's power and the lie that he was unbeatable that kept them quiet before. The Greeks too had councils of war where the commanders were urged to speak their minds, but these looked much different. These councils, however heated they became, remained modeled on those seen in Homer. Agamemnon listens to all present, even when they insult him. Those with the best ideas win. The decision to abandon Salamis is reopened with Themistocles putting forward reasoned arguments based on what he actually thought, not lies meant to profit him. Not yet, anyway. The Spartans were in charge of the fleet not because they overpowered the other city-states, but with their consent, and in fact they demanded Spartan leadership. The Aeginetans and Athenians help each other defend Greece even though they were enemies for decades, on account of the shared ideas that Greece represents, fighting each other with words instead. In battle, the diekplus is used, which, as I've discussed, requires communication and coordination between ships. Compare this to the Persians' mad rush to win the king's favor that perpetuated friendly fire. Notice also at the end of Book 8, when Alexander of Macedonia tries to win the Athenians over from Mardonius, that no one commander speaks as the ruler of Athens. Herodotus tells us instead that the Athenians responded. As a whole, as a group. He does this many times throughout the histories, as I've discussed in previous books. Such uniformity is only possible with the respect for the open dialogue of democracy that many of the Greeks, and especially the Athenians, practiced. Alexander's message itself, though deceitful, is familiar to us. Be free by making a treaty with us, without treachery and deceit, and joining our military alliance. This was the initial offer of Cyrus to the Persian people that helped to set the mold for freedom as it would be considered in their empire afterward. Be free and follow me. Given what we know of the power and godlike status of the king, it's an oxymoron. The freedom and peace offered is a lie, for it is freedom that the Athenians have been fighting for all this time. Mardonius claims that the Athenians are the only people in Greece whose wrongs the great king is prepared to forgive and with whom he wants to be on good terms. But it's actually a desire to punish and destroy Athens in particular that began the war in the first place. Imagine being Alexander, telling the Athenians about the peace and freedom offered by Xerxes with a straight face, surrounded by the burnt and crumbling ruins of Athens. This freedom and commitment to open dialogue has its risks, though. The main one is that you can't actually force people to agree with you, although Themistocles really tries. He succeeds once by tacitly threatening to leave the fleet with the majority of the ships. Later, Themistocles begins losing the debate, and it appears that the fleet will abandon Salamis. To prevent this, he sends his slave out to lie to the Persians and to get them to surround the Greeks, forcing them to adopt his plan. Because of this, they succeeded. Lies for profit is now done by a Greek, and an Athenian at that. After the battle, he continues this practice, secretly extorting all the Aegean islands. Is Themistocles the good guy or the bad guy? Do his actions prove that the Athenian or the Greek commitment to truth and dialogue is simply a sham? I don't think so. Themistocles is an exception amongst the Athenians rather than the standard. If it were otherwise, Greece would look much more like Persia, and Themistocles wouldn't have to keep his extortions a secret. Recall that the same questions surrounded Miltiades after the Battle of Marathon, as he too began making bad decisions after being hailed as a hero. Solon's mantra is what's actually active here, and it apparently applies to all. Herodotus surely expects us to make that connection between Miltiades and Themistocles, and to Solon, of course, and so we should look ahead in anticipation. Is there a penalty for Themistocles' actions? Perhaps we'll see. Herodotus tends to show rather than tell.